She lived in a small, quiet town where the streets were lined with old trees and the houses had chipped paint and creaky doors. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, but no one really paid attention to dreams. Dreams were for bigger towns, brighter lights, and people with famous names. But she had a dream. It was quiet, small, and private. Yet it burned inside her with a light no one else seemed to notice. Every day after school, she would walk down the narrow streets to the little community center, where a piano stood in the corner of a dusty room. It was not new, and the keys sometimes stuck, but it had a voice, a heart, and she treated it like a friend. She would sit on the worn bench, fingers hovering over the keys, feeling the weight of every note before she pressed it. The piano never laughed at her mistakes, never whispered that she wasn't good enough. It just let her play, letting her pour out her soul in melodies that only she could hear fully. At school, people barely noticed her. She wore plain clothes, kept her hair tied back, and moved quietly through the hallways. When the other kids talked about competitions, awards, and performances, she would smile faintly but never join the conversation. Music was her world, and she didn't need anyone to understand it. One afternoon, a letter arrived at her house, crisp and formal. She opened it with trembling hands. It was an invitation to a piano competition in the city, a place she had only seen in pictures and never imagined she would visit. The letter mentioned prestigious judges, famous competitors, and a chance to showcase her skills. But there was a line that made her stomach twist. She was asked to play a simple tune first, almost as a test. Everyone else would perform grand pieces, but she had to start small. It felt belittling, almost insulting, but she also felt a spark of opportunity. This could be her chance to show that even the simplest notes could carry the deepest meaning. When the day of the competition arrived, she stepped out of her house, clutching her sheet music. The town seemed to hold its breath as she walked past the familiar streets that had always been her world. The bus ride to the city was long, and she watched the countryside blur by, each tree and hill reminding her of home. She felt nervous, but the nervousness was not like fear. It was the kind of energy that pushed her to focus, to prepare herself mentally for what was coming. The competition hall was enormous. The ceilings were high, the lights bright, and the piano on the stage gleamed like polished marble. People whispered as she walked in. Some looked at her with curiosity, others with barely hidden judgment. They were dressed in expensive clothes, with confident smiles and practiced posture. She felt a pang of self-doubt, but she held her head high. She had worked hard, and no one could take away what she had learned on that old piano in the community center. Backstage, the other competitors were stretching their fingers, playing scales quietly, and chatting about the pieces they would perform. They glanced at her occasionally, smirking. One of them whispered, loud enough for her to hear, "She's only asked to play the simplest tune. This will be over in a second." She felt a sting, but instead of anger, she felt a quiet determination. They didn't know her. They didn't know what she was capable of. She had a secret strength, a skill honed in silence, away from eyes that judged too quickly. When her name was called, she walked to the stage. The lights were bright, and the audience was full of faces she did not know, each one expecting something ordinary. She took a deep breath and sat on the piano bench. Her fingers hovered over the keys. The room was silent, and for a moment, she felt like she and the piano were alone in a world that had no judgment, no expectation, just music. She began to play. At first, the notes were soft and simple, almost plain. But then, slowly, the music began to breathe. Every note she struck carried emotion. Every pause had meaning. Every rise and fall in melody told a story. People in the audience leaned forward, surprised at the depth of feeling coming from a simple tune. Judges exchanged glances, eyebrows raised, realizing that this was no ordinary performance. Backstage, some competitors frowned. They had expected a dull, inexperienced player, someone who would be over quickly, someone easy to forget. But this girl, quiet and unassuming, was commanding the room without flashy gestures or dramatic moves. The music itself held everyone captive. Each chord seemed to speak directly to the heart, weaving a story that was both delicate and powerful. As she played, she remembered her practice sessions at the community center. She remembered the evenings when she was the only one in the room, when her hands ached but her spirit soared. She remembered the smiles of the few neighbors who would stop by to listen, who told her she had a gift. She thought about how music had been her companion, her teacher, her friend. And now, in this grand hall, that same music was speaking to a world she had never known she could reach. The audience was changing. The smirks faded, replaced by attentive curiosity. Even the judges, who had seen countless performances and expected perfection, were caught off guard. They realized that what they were hearing was not just a simple tune. It was a performance full of feeling, intelligence, and subtle brilliance. Every movement of her fingers, every slight change in tempo, told them more about her than any grand, showy piece ever could. When the last note hung in the air and slowly faded, there was a brief silence. It was a silence filled with shock, disbelief, and awe. Then, slowly, the room erupted into applause. Some stood, some clapped quietly, but all were moved. Her eyes opened, and she saw the astonishment on the faces of everyone around her. She did not smile loudly or bask in the attention. She simply bowed her head slightly, letting the music itself be the star. The girl walked off the stage, feeling a mixture of relief and quiet pride. Backstage, other competitors looked at her with newfound respect, some even nodding slightly as if acknowledging that they had misjudged her. She did not need words to tell them she had succeeded. The music had spoken for her. The simple tune had revealed something far greater than anyone had expected. As she left the hall that evening, walking through the streets of the city back to her temporary lodging, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. From the small town with quiet streets to the bright stage filled with strangers, she had carried her music like a secret treasure. And now, for the first time, the world had glimpsed it too. She knew this was only the beginning, that many more challenges lay ahead. But she also knew that she could meet them with the same quiet courage and love for her music that had brought her this far. The simplest tune had shocked the competition, and she had shown that sometimes, the smallest notes carry the biggest stories. After her first performance, the hall was buzzing, but she remained calm, almost invisible in the chaos of admiration and whispers. She stepped away from the stage, letting the applause and excitement wash over her without letting it touch her too deeply. She had done her part. Now it was time to observe, to understand what came next, and to prepare for the more difficult pieces that awaited her in the competition. She had learned long ago that humility was as important as talent. Backstage, the other competitors were a mixture of shock, admiration, and envy. Some approached her quietly, trying to gauge how someone so unassuming could command attention with something so simple. Others whispered to each other, their expressions a mix of disbelief and nervousness. The girl didn't respond immediately. She focused on her breathing, feeling the steady rhythm of her heart and the lingering vibration of the notes she had just played. This was a moment of learning, of observing human reactions, as much as it was about music. The judges had taken notes, scribbling furiously in their score sheets, but the expressions on their faces were difficult to read. Some looked impressed, others were deep in thought, perhaps wondering how someone could make a small tune feel so large and profound. She realized then that music was more than sound. It was emotion, memory, and understanding, and she had touched something inside them that went beyond technical skill. During a short break, she walked quietly to a corner of the hall where a small piano rested. She touched the keys lightly, not to play, but to feel the familiar texture, the resistance of each note, the weight of the keys under her fingers. It was grounding, a reminder that music was her companion, not just a performance to be judged. People passed by, some glancing curiously, others not noticing her at all. In the crowd, she felt both invisible and central at the same time, a strange balance that she had learned to navigate. A few competitors, gathering courage, approached her cautiously. One asked, almost hesitantly, how she had managed to make the tune sound so expressive. She smiled softly and replied that she just played what she felt. Nothing more. Her words were simple, but they carried meaning. She didn't boast. She didn't explain technicalities. She let her music speak, and her words reflected that approach. They nodded, some still unsure, but they couldn't deny the truth in what she said. As the competition continued, the performances grew more complex. Grand concertos, fast-paced sonatas, and dramatic compositions filled the hall. Each competitor tried to impress, to demonstrate skill, flair, and stage presence. Yet, many found themselves comparing their own performances in the back of their minds to the quiet, unexpected brilliance of her simple tune. It had set a standard not of technical difficulty, but of emotional connection, of capturing attention and hearts in a way they hadn't anticipated. She watched quietly from the wings, taking note of what the judges responded to, how the audience reacted to different players, how the room's energy shifted with each note. Her observations were as important as her own performance. She understood that competitions were not just about playing music correctly. They were about communicating, connecting, and leaving an impression. Each glance, each whisper, each pause and applause told her more than the scores themselves ever could. During lunch, she sat alone on a bench outside the hall. The sun was warm, and the sounds of the city filled the air. She took out her notebook and jotted down thoughts, not about the competition, but about feelings the music had stirred within her. She reflected on her own journey, the long hours at the community center, the worn keys and creaky pedals, and the support of the few people who had believed in her when no one else did. Those memories were fuel for her soul, reminding her that this moment was just a continuation of a story that had begun years ago, quietly and without fanfare. As she walked back into the hall, the next round was about to begin. This time, the competitors were more alert, some nervous, some determined to recover lost confidence. The energy in the room shifted, a mixture of anticipation and tension. She could sense the change not just from the players but from the audience, from the judges, from the air itself. Music had a presence, a way of creating invisible threads connecting people, and she had already started to weave her influence subtly without even trying. When her next turn approached, she felt the familiar stir of nerves, but it was different now. There was a quiet confidence underneath it, built from experience, preparation, and understanding. She had proven, in a small way, that she belonged, that her talent was real. But she also knew the competition was far from over. Each piece she would play next would require focus, expression, and precision. The pressure was real, but she understood it as a challenge, not a threat. She approached the piano again. The audience watched, expecting another demonstration of her unique ability to transform simple notes into something extraordinary. The first few notes were soft, careful, and deliberate, allowing her to feel the space, the acoustics, and the mood of the room. She didn't rush, didn't show off. She played as she always had, letting the music flow naturally, allowing the tune to grow from a seed into a story. This time, however, she experimented subtly, adding small flourishes and variations that displayed her understanding of the music's depth. The audience responded, not with immediate applause, but with attentive silence. They leaned in, caught by the gentle evolution of her performance, the way a simple phrase could twist into something unexpected yet harmonious. She smiled faintly, aware of the impact she was making without overthinking it. Her competitors, watching closely, realized that this was a different level of artistry. They had thought their complex pieces and flashy techniques would be the highlight of the day, but this quiet, unassuming player was making them rethink their approach. They watched, learned, and, in some cases, felt a pang of envy. Her music was not loud or showy, but it carried authenticity, something that skill alone could not replicate. When she finished, the room held its breath again. The judges exchanged notes and whispers, visibly impressed by her growth and consistency. The applause that followed was warm and genuine, a recognition not just of technical skill, but of musical intelligence and emotional resonance. She bowed gently, acknowledging the moment, but not letting it overwhelm her. She knew the journey was ongoing, that there were more challenges ahead, and more opportunities to show the depth of her gift. Backstage, she allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. She thought about the faces she had seen, the reactions she had inspired, and the understanding she had gained. Music was her guide, her friend, and her expression, and she had discovered a power within it that extended beyond notes and rhythm. She realized that the competition was more than winning or losing. It was about connection, understanding, and growth. As the day continued, she moved quietly between the performances, observing, learning, and preparing herself mentally for the next round. Each piece played by others offered insight into different styles, techniques, and interpretations. She took notes in her mind, storing ideas, appreciating the skill around her, but never comparing herself unnecessarily. She focused on her own path, her own journey, and her own music, knowing that authenticity was her strongest asset. By evening, the first part of the competition concluded. The audience and judges had experienced a range of performances, but it was clear that her presence had left an indelible mark. People whispered her name, some asking questions about her background, some marveling at how someone so young and quiet could have such a powerful effect. She listened silently, smiling faintly to herself, understanding that recognition was not the goal, but a byproduct of doing what she loved and doing it sincerely. Walking out of the hall into the cool night air, she felt a sense of calm achievement. She had faced judgment, doubt, and expectation, and had navigated it with grace. The city lights twinkled above, and she thought about the journey ahead, knowing that more challenges awaited. Yet, she also knew that her connection with the piano, with music, and with her own inner voice would guide her through each step. This was only the beginning, and she felt ready for everything that was to come. The next day, the hall was brighter, filled with a sense of anticipation that seemed heavier than before. People whispered about the quiet girl who had played the simple tune with so much depth. Some competitors walked around nervously, practicing their scales, adjusting their posture, and trying to calm their nerves. Others simply shook their heads in disbelief, wondering how such a young and modest player had left everyone speechless. She felt a quiet satisfaction, but she didn't allow herself to be distracted. She knew the next round would be even more challenging. She arrived early, finding a corner of the hall where she could sit and collect her thoughts. Her fingers brushed over the keys of a small piano placed near the side. She didn't play, not yet. She simply let her hands feel the wood and the familiar texture of the keys. The moment was grounding, reminding her that she was prepared, that her skills were real, and that the applause from yesterday was only a small reflection of her true ability. She reminded herself that this was not about proving anything to others, but about expressing herself and connecting through music. As the first competitor of the day began their performance, she watched closely. The music was fast, dramatic, and impressive, but she noticed how the audience seemed to respond to spectacle rather than substance. The judges scribbled notes, nodding in approval, yet she felt that the connection, the subtle emotional pull, was missing. She observed quietly, taking mental notes about timing, expression, and technique. Each performance taught her something, even if it was something she would not use directly in her own playing. When it was her turn, she walked to the piano with a calm, measured pace. The audience watched, some smiling in recognition from her previous performance, some skeptical, expecting a repeat of yesterday's simple yet surprising tune. She settled onto the bench, feeling the weight of the moment, but not burdened by it. Her eyes closed for a brief second, breathing deeply, centering herself, and remembering why she played. Music was her voice, her expression, her way of speaking when words were never enough. Her hands lifted over the keys, poised with quiet confidence. She began with the simple tune again, soft and deliberate. The audience waited, unsure whether this was going to be another modest performance, or if she would surprise them again. Slowly, she introduced variations, slight shifts in tempo, delicate embellishments, and subtle dynamics that brought a new dimension to the familiar notes. Her music grew like a story, each phrase carefully shaped, each pause weighted with emotion. The hall seemed to lean in, as if the walls themselves wanted to listen more closely. People around her began to react. Some leaned forward in their seats, astonished by how a simple tune could feel so alive and expressive. Others whispered, trying to articulate what they were experiencing, struggling to put words to the emotion that flowed from the piano. The judges exchanged glances, their pens slowing as they tried to capture the unexpected brilliance unfolding before them. The girl played as if the piano were an extension of herself, every note carrying intention and meaning. She noticed subtle changes in the audience's energy. The skeptics who had doubted her yesterday were now watching in awe. The confident competitors looked tense, and the room seemed suspended in the music. She smiled faintly to herself, not out of pride, but in quiet acknowledgement that the message she wanted to convey was reaching others. Music, even simple, had the power to touch hearts, and she had learned how to do it with honesty and patience. Her performance evolved naturally, never forced, never rushed. She explored the tune's full emotional range, turning simplicity into depth, making the familiar unfamiliar and captivating. Every note was deliberate, every pause intentional. She played not to impress with complexity, but to communicate with clarity and feeling. The audience's reactions changed from polite attention to deep engagement, and she could feel their connection growing with every measure. The competitors backstage were beginning to understand that they had underestimated her. They whispered among themselves, some expressing doubt, some frustration, and others quiet admiration. They realized that this girl had something rare, something not taught in lessons or gained from experience alone. It was intuition, sensitivity, and the courage to play honestly. They had prepared to compete with skill, with speed, with technique, but she was showing them that music was about much more than that. By the middle of the performance, the hall was silent except for the piano's voice. Each note was a bridge connecting her to the listeners, carrying emotion in a way that words never could. She thought of her early days at the community center, practicing alone for hours, learning not just to hit the right keys but to feel the music fully. Every lonely evening, every small triumph and mistake, had prepared her for this moment. She played with that memory behind her, letting it guide each hand movement, each subtle shift in sound. As the final notes approached, she brought the tune to a gentle, poignant conclusion. The silence that followed was heavy with astonishment and reflection. People did not move, did not speak, as if they were holding their breath to understand the impact of what they had just heard. Then, slowly, applause began, tentative at first, then growing steadily until it filled the hall. Standing ovations rippled through the audience, and even the judges, who had seen countless performances, looked visibly moved. Her calm expression contrasted with the excitement around her, a quiet recognition that she had shared something meaningful and true. When she stood, she felt no rush to celebrate. She took a small bow, acknowledging the applause, but not letting it define her. She walked away from the piano bench with the same quiet grace she had shown when entering. Backstage, other competitors gave her respectful nods, some whispered words of admiration, and a few even looked thoughtful, re-examining their own approach to music. She had not only played a tune, she had shifted perspectives. Later, when the scores were announced for the round, her performance was highlighted by the judges. They praised not only her technical skill but her emotional intelligence, her ability to make the simplest piece resonate so deeply. They noted the courage it took to perform with honesty and authenticity, something that many overlooked in favor of spectacle. She received recognition, yes, but more importantly, she had demonstrated the power of music to communicate universally, without need for grandeur or complexity. Walking out of the hall that evening, she felt a mixture of relief and quiet excitement. The day had been long and demanding, but it had also affirmed her belief in her abilities and in the approach she had always taken. She reflected on the lessons learned, the faces of people she had touched, and the personal growth she had achieved. Music was more than notes. It was connection, understanding, and courage, and she had wielded it well. She returned to her lodging with a sense of calm satisfaction. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more competitors, and new pieces to play. But she knew that she had the inner strength, experience, and emotional depth to meet whatever came next. The simple tune had once again proven itself as a vessel for greatness, and she felt ready to continue her journey, confident that her music could touch more hearts and leave a lasting impression. The moment she walked back onto the stage for her next performance, the energy in the hall had changed. There was an anticipation, a sense that something special was about to happen. People remembered her first two performances, the way she had made a simple tune feel alive and profound. Whispers ran through the audience, some expressing excitement, others curiosity, all wondering what she would do next. She felt the weight of their eyes, but she welcomed it. She knew that this was her moment to show the full depth of her skill. Sitting at the piano, she allowed herself a small breath, letting the nerves settle and focusing on the music. She did not rush. Her fingers touched the keys lightly, feeling their resistance, the familiar texture, and the echo of notes in the room. The tune she was asked to play again was simple, yet she had learned that simplicity was not a limitation. In her hands, it could become a story, a journey, an experience that everyone could feel. She closed her eyes for a moment, visualizing the path she wanted to take, the emotion she wanted to convey. She began to play. The opening notes were soft and gentle as expected, almost as if she were testing the room once again. But soon subtle changes emerged. She added slight pauses, gentle emphasis on certain notes, and a delicate rise and fall in tempo. The tune started to breathe in a new way, carrying weight and feeling that the audience had not anticipated. Those watching closely leaned forward, caught by the transformation happening in front of them. The judges, who had seen hundreds of performances, were visibly intrigued. They had not expected such a simple piece to be treated with such thought and creativity. Each note seemed deliberate, each movement of her hands a reflection of thoughtfulness and emotion. Her music was no longer just technically correct. It was expressive, living, and powerful in a subtle, quiet way. The audience began to respond unconsciously, swaying slightly, closing eyes, letting the music wash over them. Backstage, the other competitors watched with a mix of awe and disbelief. They had prepared complicated pieces filled with fast runs, dramatic shifts, and showy techniques, expecting to impress the judges and audience. Yet here was someone using a simple melody, and with careful attention, transforming it into something extraordinary. They could see the effect it had, the connection she was creating, and they felt a pang of humility. They realized that talent was not only in technical skill but in understanding, in expression, and in courage. Her music began to build naturally, introducing small embellishments and variations that added layers of depth. The tune, though simple at its core, now seemed vast and intricate. Each phrase was a story, each pause a breath of emotion, each crescendo a rising wave of feeling. The audience was silent, fully absorbed, as if they had forgotten to breathe, captivated by the evolution of the piece. She played not to impress with speed or complexity, but to tell a story that everyone could understand and feel. As the performance continued, some in the audience began to recognize the genius in simplicity. They watched her hands move gracefully, the precision of each keystroke, and the way the music seemed to unfold naturally, as though it had been waiting to be discovered. There was no flashiness, no unnecessary embellishment, just pure expression. And yet, it was compelling, moving, and unforgettable. She thought of the evenings spent at the community center, alone with the piano, practicing, learning, failing, and trying again. She remembered the encouragement of the few who had believed in her, the quiet moments of discovery, the small victories that had no audience. All those experiences had shaped her approach, teaching her patience, discipline, and the ability to listen not just to the notes, but to the story behind them. Every bit of preparation came together in this moment, and she played with the confidence of someone who knew her path. By the middle of the piece, the music had taken on a life of its own. The audience could feel the subtle emotions embedded in every note: joy, longing, hope, and reflection. Some held their hands over their hearts, moved in a way they had not expected. Judges stopped scribbling for a moment, eyes wide, listening with intent, absorbing not just the sound but the feeling that flowed through it. Competitors whispered among themselves, realizing that they were witnessing something rare and extraordinary. She played with a delicate balance of control and freedom, allowing the melody to breathe and stretch without losing its form. Each chord was intentional, each pause meaningful. Her music was a conversation with the audience, a quiet dialogue that transcended words. She noticed a few people leaning forward, eyes glistening, caught in the emotion she had woven into the simplest tune. She smiled faintly, not in arrogance, but in recognition that music had the power to connect in a way nothing else could. As she neared the final section of the piece, she allowed the music to expand fully, letting each note carry its weight, letting the tune bloom into a gentle climax. The hall was silent except for the piano's voice, and even the air seemed to hold its breath. She poured all her energy, emotion, and experience into the last few measures, crafting a conclusion that felt both inevitable and surprising, simple yet profound. When the final note faded, there was a brief, weighty silence. No one moved, no one spoke, as if the audience collectively realized the impact of what they had just witnessed. Then, slowly, the applause began, hesitant at first, then swelling into a roaring ovation. Some stood, some clapped quietly, but every person in the hall had been touched. The judges, who were often reserved and analytical, exchanged nods of respect, impressed by the artistry and emotional depth of the performance. The girl rose from the bench with a quiet grace, bowing slightly to acknowledge the applause. She did not rush, did not smile broadly, but allowed herself a moment to appreciate the response. Backstage, competitors looked at her with a mixture of awe, respect, and a hint of envy. Some whispered words of admiration, acknowledging that they had underestimated her. The simple tune had become a vessel for something extraordinary, and she had guided it with subtle brilliance. As she stepped away from the piano, she felt a sense of fulfillment. She had not only played the notes but had shared her understanding, her feeling, her story. The applause, the astonishment, the respect. It was gratifying, but it was secondary. The true reward was in the connection she had created, in the way the music had spoken beyond words, touching hearts and minds alike. Walking backstage, she took a quiet breath and reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From the quiet town to the competition hall, from the old piano at the community center to this grand stage, each step had prepared her for this moment. She realized that talent alone was not enough. It was passion, preparation, humility, and the courage to be herself that had allowed her to transform the simplest tune into something unforgettable. That evening, as she left the hall, she felt a calm joy. The city lights sparkled above, but she thought of the small town that had nurtured her, the quiet streets, and the piano that had been her companion for years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but she felt ready. The simple tune had shocked the competition, but more importantly, it had revealed the power of authenticity, patience, and emotion in music. She knew that her journey was only beginning, and that the path ahead, though uncertain, would be guided by the music that lived in her hands and heart. The hall was alive with a tension that had built over the past few days. Everyone knew something special was happening, and whispers of admiration mixed with disbelief ran through the audience and competitors alike. She walked toward the piano for her next performance with a quiet confidence, the weight of expectation settling on her shoulders but not crushing her spirit. She had learned to carry pressure like a steady rhythm, letting it guide her focus instead of distracting her. Each step toward the piano was measured, deliberate, as though she were walking into her own world where music and expression were the only rules. Sitting at the bench, she let her fingers hover above the keys. The simple tune awaited her, but she had already transformed it in her mind, imagining the journey it could take the audience on. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the connection between her heart and her hands. She remembered the long evenings at the community center, the quiet streets of her town, and the few people who had believed in her. They were a part of her performance, silently encouraging her, reminding her that the music had always been hers to share, regardless of what others expected. The first notes were soft, gentle, and familiar, but as her fingers moved, she began to shape them differently, giving them depth, subtle variations, and emotion that made the room lean in. The audience, already aware of her talent, watched with anticipation, uncertain of how this performance would unfold. Each note carried intent, each pause carried meaning, and every phrase unfolded like a story. It was as if the simple tune had grown wings, flying into a space far larger than the hall, reaching the hearts of everyone present. Competitors backstage whispered among themselves, their earlier confidence replaced with awe and, for some, anxiety. They had trained for technical mastery, for speed and showmanship, yet here was someone transforming simplicity into something profound. It made them reconsider what they knew about performance, talent, and music itself. Some glanced at one another, trying to find an explanation for what they were witnessing, while others simply remained silent, captivated by the artistry unfolding before them. The judges, who had grown accustomed to reviewing talent through precision and complexity, were struck by her ability to communicate so much through so little. Each note resonated with clarity and purpose, creating a tension and release that left listeners breathless. They scribbled notes, but their eyes never left her hands. They felt the honesty, the discipline, and the emotion that could not be quantified by technique alone. This was music that spoke to the soul, and they recognized it instantly. As the performance progressed, her music evolved naturally. She added small flourishes, subtle variations, and shifts in dynamics that highlighted the beauty of the tune without overwhelming it. The simple melody became a living entity, expressive and unpredictable, yet perfectly coherent. The audience was spellbound, some closing their eyes to fully immerse themselves, others leaning forward to catch every nuance. The silence that filled the hall was not emptiness, but attentive listening, a collective focus that made each note more powerful. She played not for recognition, not for applause, but because she understood the tune intimately, because she wanted to share its hidden depths. Every chord, every touch, every pause was intentional, conveying emotions that could not be spoken. The audience felt the story, the journey, and the honesty of her performance. Some gasped quietly at moments of brilliance, others held their hands over their hearts, moved in ways they could not articulate. The simple tune had become a bridge connecting the performer to every listener in the hall. As the piece neared its conclusion, she allowed the music to reach a gentle, yet profound climax. The notes flowed seamlessly, rising and falling like waves, carrying emotion that seemed larger than the hall itself. Her hands moved with both control and freedom, balancing precision with expression. Every measure was deliberate, every chord intentional, and the melody carried with it a sense of inevitability and surprise at the same time. The audience was silent, holding their breath, caught in the moment, unable to look away. When the final note hung in the air and slowly faded, the room stayed silent for a heartbeat longer than expected. Then came the eruption of applause, standing ovations, cheers, and exclamations of astonishment. People clapped with a mixture of admiration and disbelief, moved not only by technical skill but by the emotion and depth she had conveyed. The judges looked at each other, nodding, some smiling softly, others visibly moved. They had seen great performances before, but few had the emotional impact and authenticity of this moment. She rose from the bench, bowing quietly, acknowledging the audience without letting the attention overwhelm her. Backstage, competitors looked at her with a mixture of awe and humility. Some whispered their admiration, others nodded in respect, realizing they had underestimated her. The room was filled with energy, but she remained calm, letting the music itself be the center of attention. She had not only played the tune, she had told a story, shared a part of herself, and reminded everyone that simplicity could hold extraordinary power. Later, as she stepped off the stage, she felt a quiet satisfaction. She walked through the hallways of the building, hearing the echoes of applause still lingering, watching the reactions of people around her. Some were still discussing the performance in hushed tones, trying to understand how a simple tune could leave such an impression. She smiled faintly to herself, knowing that the impact of music was not always immediate, but lasting, and that she had touched something deep within those who listened. In her room that evening, she reflected on the journey that had led her here. She thought of her small town, the quiet evenings at the community center, and the old piano that had been her constant companion. She remembered the mistakes, the small victories, the hours of practice, and the moments when she felt doubt. Each of those experiences had shaped her, prepared her, and guided her hands to create something that resonated beyond notes on a page. She realized that the simple tune had become a vehicle for her voice, for her story, and for the emotions she wanted to share. Tomorrow would bring the final round, and she knew the challenge would only increase. There would be more competitors, more expectations, and more pressure. But she felt ready, not because she sought recognition or fame, but because she had discovered the power of music to communicate, to connect, and to transform. She understood that true performance was not about impressing others with complexity, but about expressing oneself honestly, fully, and with courage. As she prepared for sleep that night, she felt a sense of calm excitement. The journey was ongoing, and the challenges ahead would test her skill, focus, and determination. Yet she was confident, not in arrogance, but in the knowledge that she could face them with the same quiet dedication that had carried her this far. The simple tune had shocked the competition, but more importantly, it had revealed the depth of her talent, the honesty of her expression, and the extraordinary potential that lay within her hands and heart. The final day of the competition arrived, bringing with it a quiet tension that filled the hall. Everyone who had been following the young girl's performances knew that something extraordinary had already taken place. Whispers circulated, speculation about her skill, her style, and what she might play next. Competitors who had once dismissed her were now cautious, some nervous, some deeply respectful. She walked into the hall with calm determination, her focus inward, fully aware that this round could decide her fate, but also knowing that her journey was more than a single victory. Sitting at the piano, she let her hands rest gently on the keys. She allowed herself a moment to close her eyes, to breathe deeply, and to feel the rhythm of her own heart. The room was quiet, expectant. She remembered the simple piano in her town, the evenings of practice, the empty streets, the tiny moments of triumph. She felt those memories surrounding her, guiding her fingers, steadying her focus. Music had always been her language, and she would speak it now, fully and honestly. She began with the familiar simple tune, gentle and soft, but as the melody unfolded, it carried a weight, a presence that grew with each note. The audience, already aware of her talent, leaned in, captivated not only by the notes but by the emotions they conveyed. Her fingers moved with a natural grace, each chord deliberate, each pause meaningful. The simple tune began to expand, transforming subtly yet powerfully, carrying a story that was invisible yet clear to all who listened. Backstage, other competitors watched with a mixture of admiration and tension. They had practiced for years, mastered complex pieces, and trained for this moment. Yet here was someone unassuming, using a simple tune to create a performance that seemed limitless. They whispered to each other, questioning how it was possible. Some glanced at her with respect, others with a quiet envy. They realized that she had a rare gift, the ability to connect deeply through music, to communicate beyond technical skill. The judges, too, were captivated. Their pens paused mid-note, eyes wide, absorbing the performance with intensity. They noted how the melody, though simple, had evolved into something rich and intricate. The music seemed alive, speaking of experiences, emotions, and understanding that went beyond formal training. They exchanged glances, some nodding subtly, acknowledging that what they were witnessing was not merely talent, but artistry, intuition, and authenticity. As the performance progressed, she began to introduce subtle variations and emotional depth that made the tune feel alive. It was not about speed or technical showmanship, but about intention and connection. The music flowed like a conversation, an intimate dialogue between her and the audience. Each note reached out, touching the hearts of everyone in the hall. People leaned forward, closed their eyes, or whispered softly to themselves, moved by the purity and emotion of her performance. Her competitors began to realize the significance of what she was doing. They had entered the competition expecting to impress with technical mastery, Yet they were witnessing something far more powerful. The ability to move people, to communicate without words, to transform a simple melody into a profound experience. Some felt challenged to reconsider their own approach, while others simply watched, humbled and inspired. The melody continued to evolve under her fingers. She allowed the tune to expand naturally, each phrase rising and falling with emotion, each chord carrying intention. The audience was held spellbound, drawn into a world created by her touch, where simplicity revealed its hidden strength. Some held their hands over their hearts, tears glimmered in eyes, and soft sighs filled the air. She did not notice the individual reactions, only the collective presence, the shared experience of music connecting every listener to her story. The climax approached, and she let the music swell gently yet powerfully. Every note was deliberate, every pause meaningful, every nuance crafted with care. The simple tune had grown into a profound statement, a culmination of her talent, preparation, and emotional insight. She felt the connection with the audience, judges, and even her competitors, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had witnessed. The room was alive with attention, yet calm, as if suspended in the music itself. When the final note rang out and faded into silence, the hall held its breath for a heartbeat longer than expected. Then, applause erupted, hesitant at first, then growing into a thunderous ovation. People stood, clapped, and cheered, some with tears in their eyes, others with smiles of astonishment. Judges rose to their feet, nodding in respect, some visibly moved by the performance they had just witnessed. Her competitors, too, were silent for a moment, then offered genuine admiration, acknowledging the rare brilliance of her interpretation. She rose from the piano bench with quiet grace, bowing to the audience, accepting the applause without letting it overwhelm her. Her expression remained calm, humble, and composed. She had shared something deeply personal through music, and the response was affirmation of her ability, not just her technical skill but her capacity to touch lives. She felt a sense of fulfillment that surpassed awards or recognition. It was the joy of connection, the reward of sharing her heart with others. Later, when the judges announced the results, her name was at the top. The audience erupted in cheers once again. She had won, but the victory felt almost secondary to what had been accomplished. She had shown that simplicity, honesty, and emotional expression could create an impact greater than complexity or spectacle. She realized that the journey of music was ongoing, and that every performance was a chance to communicate and connect, not just a contest to be won. Walking out of the hall into the quiet evening, she reflected on her journey. She thought of her small town, the long hours at the community center, the old piano that had been her companion for years. She remembered the encouragement of a few who believed in her, the mistakes, the learning, and the quiet moments of triumph. All of it had brought her to this moment, allowing her to show that talent was not only in skill, but in understanding, in empathy, and in the courage to be true to oneself. She returned to her lodging with a calm sense of joy. She knew that more challenges awaited her, more performances, more stages, and more opportunities to grow. Yet she felt ready, grounded in her love for music and in the connection it created with others. The simple tune had shocked the competition, inspired awe, and left a lasting impression. More importantly, it had shown her and the world the extraordinary potential hidden within simplicity, patience, and authenticity. That night, as she rested, she felt a quiet excitement for the future. The journey was only beginning, and each step forward would carry the lessons, the experiences, and the emotions she had gained. Music was not just a skill, but a language, a bridge, and a companion. She had learned how to wield it with honesty and care, touching hearts and leaving memories. The competition had ended, but the music, and her journey, would continue, carrying her forward into new stages, new challenges, and new opportunities to inspire.